So, what's St. Patrick's Day all about? Why would I choose him as an illustration? Well, if you know the real St. Patrick, you'll honor him for being among one of the greatest ambassadors in history. He ranks among the most amazing reconcilers of any time period and an architect of transformation that is very few people have exceeded in the history of planet Earth. Let me tell you a little bit more. St. Patrick was born in 386 AD in Britain to wealthy parents near the end of the 4th century. He's believed to have died on March 17th around 460 AD. Now, at the age of 16, Patrick is taken prison by a group of Irish raiders who are attacking his family's estate. They transport him to Ireland. Now, on a map, this is a map of Europe, and you've got the European mainland here with Italy and Spain and so forth. And then right off of the coast, the northwest coast, are the British Isles. This is Great Britain, and this is Ireland right here. When he was 16 years old, Irish raiders came into Great Britain. They took his family, and they exported him as a slave to Ireland, where he spent 6 years in captivity. Now, during this time, he was a shepherd. He was a slave shepherd who worked off in the fields. He learned the Irish language. He learned the traditions of the local people. And in his lonely hours out in the pastures, he turned to contemplative prayer. And he turned to many of the ideas that he had learned from his religious family. And he found that in the aloneness, he connected with God in very deep ways. As a matter of fact, he would write in his journals later on that his experiences with God out in the pasture were some of the deepest experiences that he had in his life, where he literally heard God's voice. And he felt very close to God in this natural environment. Well, after about 6 years later as a prisoner, Patrick escaped from the Irish people that had been enslaving him. According to his writing, a voice, God's voice, spoke very clearly to him in a dream, telling him it was time to leave Ireland. So in the middle of the night, Patrick walked and eventually walked nearly 200 miles from County Mayo, where it's believed that he was held, to the Irish coast. Soon afterwards, when he sailed to Great Britain, he decided to head into a course of ministry. And in the midst of his religious training, it lasted for 15 years, his training and his action in the Catholic Church. He became a priest, and a very good priest, a highly esteemed priest. A little bit later on in his life, when he was in his mid-40s, the time that was the end of the average lifespan of somebody during that time, he received another vision, and this vision was to start a new course of his ministry, to take all the things that he had learned and take them back to Ireland. When he decided to do that, not only did he receive the permission and blessing of the Catholic Church, but he was promoted to be a bishop and became the world's first bishop missionary. Well, this moment, this revelation proved to be a moment of truth for Patrick and eventually for all of Europe. Patrick had to overcome the pain of his former abuse, of actually being entrapped, stolen, and enslaved by another culture, and to go the very culture that had abused him in order to bring God to those people. It's reconciliation embodied in St. Patrick along the horizontal spectrum, where he had to forgive his enemies and bring good news to them. This is the way of the cross. This is what Jesus did with you and me. He forgave us as his enemies, and he brought us the message of good news. And so Patrick does the same exact thing that Jesus did for him. Being an agent of reconciliation means letting go of your biases, loving people who have hurt you, and loving them and obeying God regardless of barriers of race or culture or gender or economics. And Patrick, he said yes to this. So he went to Ireland in the early 5th century, along with a handful of priests who he took along with him, and a few apprentice lay leaders, probably somewhere between 12 and 20 people, shipped off from Britain to go to Ireland in order to take the gospel there. Now, Patrick was uniquely equipped to be able to bring the gospel to these people, because first of all, he spoke the language of the people of Ireland. He knew how they would receive the message. He knew their culture, he knew their stories, he knew their symbols, and he was able to contextualize the eternal, unchanging message of Jesus into a culture that has changing cultural forms. He spoke their language to bring them the good news. For example, Patrick is famous for pioneering the idea that the shamrock can be a representation of the Trinity. Just like the shamrock has one plant with 3 different leaves, so our God is one God with 3 different persons. He used common pagan imagery of the sun and light to build bridges into his community, bridges of understanding that Jesus is, in fact, the light of the world. And he combined and incorporated the artwork, the Celtic knotwork that was prevalent during his day, into images of the cross with the symbol of the light, and he made up this new artistic form called the Celtic cross. You seen these before? So in the Celtic cross, what you can find is not only the powerful image of the cross of Jesus, but the circle representing the sun, or Jesus as the light of the world, and then Celtic knotwork that represents the intertwined relationships that come between all people who have come to the cross together. A very cool piece of symbolism. I personally don't have any tattoos on my body right now, but I've oftentimes thought if I ever did get a tattoo, I would love to get a Celtic cross tattoo on my body. That's probably too much information, wasn't it? Sorry, I can't take it back. It's already out now. Well, for Patrick, in a culture that valued story and legend over science and reason, he gave them one big story, the Jesus story, that made sense of all of their little stories. See, he was a genius at using the clues that God had already left in their culture, finding ways that God had already been at work in the hearts of the Irish people and applying the eternal story of God to the way that he had already been at work in this particular culture. He did things different than the typical Roman church might do at that time. At the time, the Roman Catholic Church would go into a city and they would build up a large building, a cathedral in the middle of a city, and invite everybody to come to their particular cathedral. Patrick, in contrast, decided to set up small monastic environments at crossroads of the Irish countryside. He would take his 12 to 20 people and set up at a crossroads because the Irish people were highly mobile at that time. And he and his 20 or so companions, after they create the settlement, would welcome any passersby into their community. These were not monasteries that were built on the mountainside far away from people. They were designed to engage people in the middle of the places where they would frequent, and they were deeply involved in the life of community and highly evangelistic. Now, the communities themselves were built in concentric circles, and these circles weren't brick buildings. They were just flimsy wooden structures that anybody could break through anytime they wanted to. But they became known and famous because everybody was welcome inside these circles. Guests were given the highest honor, and soon the community of lay people and young men who wanted to study as priests and young women who became known as virgins for Christ, these numbers swelled in number. Patrick began to speak out against slavery for obvious reasons. As a matter of fact, he's the first public figure in Europe who's known to have spoken out against slavery. And soon, this community was marked as a very different kind of people. Not because they had power, but because they chose service. Not because they were taking anything over by war, but because they chose peace and love and righteousness. And these communities would swell. And once they got to a certain point, what Patrick would do is he would leave one of his very best priests in charge of that community. And the local people who joined in that community would become that community. And he would take a bunch of other priests and his other people on down the road to the next set of crossroads where they would set up a camp with concentric circles and welcome everybody to come in and be a part of it. And pretty soon that would swell in numbers. And he would leave one priest behind, a bunch of people, and he would take his people to another place and set up a new camp. And pretty soon, by the end of Patrick's life, 74 years old, they think is how old he was when he died. So in those 30 years, Patrick and his followers started 700 of these little monastic communities all throughout Ireland. 700 of them became little churches that dotted the countryside. And when he did, an entirely new brand of Catholicism, evangelism, and Christian practice had been born. And this movement spread like wildfire across the Irish landscape and replaced the ancient forms of Druidism and paganism as the dominant religion in Ireland without even a hint of violence anywhere. Patrick never really banished any snakes from Ireland, But snakes were a dominant symbol that was used by the Druidic leaders of the day. They would oftentimes tattoo snakes that would go up and down their arms. So while Patrick never really banished real live snakes from Ireland, symbolically, he may have banished a few symbolic snakes from that country. Now, this is what happened in Ireland itself, but Thomas Cahill puts Patrick and the Irish who followed him on even a higher pedestal. Thomas Cahill is a historian who wrote the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, and the contention of his book is that the Irish actually, you guessed it, saved civilization. You see, Patrick's monasteries not only led people to faith in Jesus, but they also maintained literacy and education as high values in a largely illiterate culture. They preserved the Hebrew Bible, the Greek Bible, Greek commentaries, a great deal of ancient Greek literature, and ancient Latin literature. And they became the centerpiece for learning in each of these languages with these books. Now, at the same time as Patrick is establishing this in Ireland, a movement is sweeping across the European countryside. Beginning in 406 BC, the Germanic hordes, the barbarian hordes, crossed the Rhine River and began to invade all of Western Europe. They also took over a great deal of Eastern Europe. And those of you who are historians know that by 476 AD, the Roman government, which had taken over most of Europe, shrank, and eventually you had the fall of Rome in 476 AD. Well, for a few centuries afterwards, the Germanic barbarian hordes were in charge of all of Europe, and it's a period that became known as the Dark Ages because of the low amount of literacy, recorded history, and low value on books and learning. These hordes destroyed great libraries, great churches, and great cities all over Europe and the northern Mediterranean. And after Rome had fallen, this group of people brought a new pattern of thought. Not that of subordinating one thought to another with mathematical precision, but instead of apprehended similarities and balances, types and paradigms, parallels and symbols. It was not a world of thought, but much more a world of image. But this group of people, although they conquered much of Europe, were never able to get to the island nation of Ireland. And so the people of St. Patrick continued with their literature and literacy and learning and Christianizing that island nation. By the 7th and 8th centuries, the barbarian hordes had begun to lose power, and the Irish monastic community began to peacefully engage with the European mainland. Listen to what Thomas Cahill writes in his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. He says this: "Wherever they went, the Irish brought with them their books, many unseen in Europe for centuries, and tied to their waist as signs of triumph, just as Irish heroes had once tied to their waist their enemies' heads. Wherever they went, they brought their love of learning and their skills in bookmaking. In the bays and valleys of their exile, they reestablished literacy and breathed new life into the exhausted literary culture of Europe. And that is how the Irish saved civilization." And it all goes back to one guy, St. Patrick. I mean, imagine what European culture would have looked like without this amazing preservation and re-engagement with biblical literature and Greek literature and ancient literature in general. This Renaissance all traces back to one man who believed in reconciliation. One man who said, "I will be an ambassador for Christ despite the pain that's been given to me." One man who turned slavery into submission, into transformation of an entire culture, and eventually an entire continent.